I know you, and you probably know me already. But it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight and to thank you for coming to this special bonus edition to the Gay Hart Gaines Distinguished Visiting Lecturer of American History series at Mount Vernon. As many of you know, this series is designed to provide a deeper understanding of particular topics related to George Washington's life and legacy. And this year, we are addressing George Washington and the American Union, a fascinating story being told brilliantly by Dr. Ed Larson. Dr. Larson will continue the series on November 13th, but tonight we will depart from his captivating narrative to hear what a profound effect George Washington and the founding era had on another guardian of freedom and liberty, Abraham Lincoln. Before I introduce our special guest, the renowned author Richard Brookhiser, I would like to mention that the Gay Hart Gaines Lecture Series was established in 2007 through a generous gift from Louis Lehrman to honor his good friend Gay for her extraordinary patriotism and leadership at Mount Vernon. Mr. Lehrman himself is a noted author and co-founder of the Gilder Lehrman Institute, which is a partner of Mount Vernon in the prestigious George Washington Book Prize. Gay could not be here tonight. I think she'll be here at the next lecture, but I did want to acknowledge again her monumental contributions to Mount Vernon. During her 13-year tenure with the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, Gay was not only an unparalleled fundraiser, in fact, unparalleled in our entire history, she was also a wonderfully talented and spirited regent. A tough act to follow, I might add, whose dedication to our mission inspired all of us. She's respected and beloved by all of us at Mount Vernon who have had the honor and the privilege and the pleasure of working with her. And I would also like to recognize, if she's here, because she usually is, although I don't see her, maybe she's caught in traffic, Dee Dee Petri, our Vice Regent for Wisconsin. Like Gay, Dee Dee is relentless in pursuing our mission and has chaired our education committee and spearheaded any number of George Washington-oriented education initiatives here on the estate and in Wisconsin, with her customary mark of diligence and excellence. Now, I have the honor of presenting tonight's lecturer, journalist, author, biographer, and historian Richard Brookhiser. Over his remarkable career, Mr. Brookhiser's articles have appeared in a variety of magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic Monthly, Time, and Vanity Fair. He is the author of numerous books on revolutionary America and the Founding Fathers, to include George Washington on Leadership and Founding Father, Rediscovering George Washington, as well as other biographies of leading names of the era, such as James Madison, Gouverneur Morris, and Alexander Hamilton. Beginning his career with the National Review in 1977 at the age of 23, he was the youngest senior editor in the history of the magazine, and this is a position he still holds today, although he's not the youngest anymore. You could actually calculate that in 1977. In the world of film and TV, he was the author and host of Rediscovering George Washington, a film by Michael Pack, which aired on PBS in 2002. Mr. Brookhiser was also the historian curator of Alexander Hamilton, The Man Who Made Modern America, a 2004 exhibition at the New York Historical Society. In 2008, he was awarded the prestigious National Humanities Medal by President George W. Bush, and we are delighted to have such a distinguished speaker and author here with us tonight. Some of the themes of tonight's lecture are taken from his new book, Founder's Son, which was just released on October 2nd and will be available in the shops after the lecture, and I'm sure Mr. Brookhiser would be happy to sign your copy. So please join me in welcoming Richard Brookhiser.
Well, thank you. Can everybody hear? Everybody here? Okay, good. Thank you for that introduction. It's always a great pleasure to be here at Mount Vernon. I realize this is my first time here without Jim Reese, and that was a little poignant. But then I thought that's wrong, because Jim wanted to make this a place that would go on and on and on, even as Washington's legacy has gone on and on and on in this country. And tonight I want to, among other things, talk about one aspect of that posthumous life of George Washington in the life of the 16th president. Abraham Lincoln was devoted to the Founding Fathers. He turned to them for guidance and inspiration, and he used them to persuade and to lead his fellow Americans. Probably his most famous expression of that was at the beginning of the Gettysburg Address in November 1863, where he said that our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty. But 3 years before that, in February 1860, in his Cooper Union speech, which kicked off his first run for the presidency, he said of slavery, "As our fathers marked it, so let it be again marked, as an evil not to be extended. Let us speak as they spoke, and act as they acted upon it." And then 6 years before that, in his speech at Peoria in October 1854, which was the beginning of his mature political career, he said, "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit of the Revolution. Let us return slavery to the position our fathers gave it." Tonight I want to talk about the three founding fathers that I think were most important to Lincoln: George Washington, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson. I also want to talk about two other fathers in his life. His own father, Thomas Lincoln. I think Lincoln's dissatisfaction with his father explains some of the passion that he brought to the founding fathers. And finally, God the Father, because in the Civil War, even the founding fathers were not enough to explain the carnage of that conflict. So let's begin with the first father, Thomas Lincoln. He was a Virginian who moved to Kentucky, and then after he had a family, he moved to the new state of Indiana, and finally to Illinois, where he died. And in a lot of ways, he was a responsible man and a responsible parent. He had 3 children: Sarah, Abraham, and an infant Thomas who died after 3 days. He never left bad debts. He never went broke. He was picked to serve on several juries, which was a sign of respectability. He was the trustee of a Baptist church in Indiana, where his family worshiped. And he sent his daughter and his son, Sarah and Abraham, to school because he wanted them to learn how to read and write. Abraham went to 5 different one-room schools, 2 when he was a little boy in Kentucky, 3 in Indiana. If you add up all the time he spent in his schools, it's about a year. But he did learn how to read, how to write, and how to do simple mathematics. But Abraham and Thomas never saw eye to eye. And one reason was work. Abraham said later that his father learned me how to work but never learned me to love it. And that was because the father hired him out. When he became a teenager, when he'd grown to his full size, his father would hire him out to work on other people's farms and fields, and all the money that Abraham earned, Thomas kept. Now, this was a common practice, but common practices strike different people different ways, and Abraham didn't like it. The other difference between them was that although Thomas wanted his son to know how to read, he could not understand reading as a passion or as a pastime. And this was something that was a part of Abraham's life early on. He read any book he could get his hands on. If he didn't understand something, he would ask what it meant. He would say it over to himself. He'd repeat it. He would write it down. Then he'd write it down in a different form. And if he didn't have paper, he would write it in charcoal on a board, and then he'd plane off the board to have new space to write more. Reading and writing took him out of himself. It took him deeper into himself. It was an experience that his father just didn't get. His stepmother did understand this. Lincoln's own mother died when he was 9. His father remarried when Abraham was almost 11. And his second wife, who survived her husband and her son, Sarah Bush Lincoln, she did see that she had an unusual stepson, and she saw the importance of reading to him. And it's from her that we have these accounts of how this young boy was educating himself with the books that he had. Now, I do think that Abraham got something from his father, 3 things. One was strength. They were both strong men. They were differently built. Thomas was 5'10", stocky. Abraham, of course, was long and lean and 6'4", but they were both powerful. And both of them had to survive what I would call communal hazing. You know, if you were the new guy in town, you had to wrestle with the local tough guy to prove yourself. And both Thomas and Abraham did this well and were accepted as a result. So that was one inheritance. A second was temperance. Thomas Lincoln was not a drinker, and this was very unusual in early 19th century America. Gordon Wood wrote a history of the period recently where he gave figures for alcohol consumption in the early 19th century, and it's just astounding what people drank. This was a country of alcoholics. But Thomas did not drink, nor did Abraham. And this was a second inheritance. The third and the most important was storytelling. 2 cousins of the Lincoln family, cousins of the first wife, John and Dennis Hanks, they said, one of them said that Thomas Lincoln was as good a storyteller as Abraham. The other said he was a better storyteller than Abraham. So this was a quality that the son must have heard at his father's knee, must have learned from his father. But Abraham never mentioned these things. He never acknowledged them. One of the few times he ever referred to his father was in a campaign autobiography in 1860, where he said that his father never learned more than bunglingly to write his own name. And I think there's so much scorn in that word, bunglingly. He's saying, I learned to write my own name. I learned to write more. You could have, but you didn't. So the two of them just never saw eye to eye. So Abraham did what we all do when our families let us down, and all our families let us down in one way or another. He looked for substitutes. He looked for surrogates. And the surrogates that he found, which were common and available surrogates for young men in early 19th century America, were the Founding Fathers. They were our first greatest generation. These were the men who had won the Revolution, written the Constitution. And many of them were still alive and even active when Lincoln was a boy. A month after his birth, Thomas Jefferson left the White House. And then he was followed in the White House by 8 years of James Madison, the father of the Constitution. And then Madison was followed by 8 years of the last Founding Father president, James Monroe. So this takes Lincoln up to his teenage years. But when Lincoln was in his 20s, in the 1830s, the last of the Founding Fathers finally die off. Now, none of them ever went west where the Lincolns lived. Lincoln never went east where they lived. Lincoln was certainly not in their social class. So the only way he could encounter them was in books. And the first founding father to make an impression on him, in the first book he read, was about George Washington. And it was The Life of George Washington by Mason Locke Weems, Parson Weems. Now, Weems was an ordained Episcopal clergyman, but he made his living as a book publisher and book dealer. He was an itinerant. He'd go up and down the East Coast selling books. And Weems knew George Washington very slightly. He'd written him a letter. He'd visited him once at Mount Vernon. And he realized that a biography of Washington would be a great seller. So Washington dies in 1799. Weems is out with The Life of George Washington in 1800. Then in 1808 he expands the book, and that would be the version that Lincoln read. And it's still in print, both in scholarly editions and also, just normal editions to read to your children. Now, if you read The Life of Washington, Weems's sentences are not very good, but his stories are terrific. And the proof is that we remember some of them. They're in the popular consciousness. The most famous is probably the story of Washington and the cherry tree. Young George is given a hatchet by his father. In swinging it around, he accidentally chops the bark of a prize cherry tree. When his father sees what happens, he asks his son, how did this happen? And the son says, I can't tell a lie, Pa. You know I can't tell a lie. I did it. And then the father praises him for being honest. But that's not what most impressed Abraham Lincoln in Weems's life. What most impressed him was Weems's account of the Battle of Trenton, the crossing of the Delaware, and the desperate wintertime attack on the Hessians at the end of 1776, which saved the Revolution at its most desperate point. And we know that this is what impressed Lincoln because Lincoln himself said so in 1861 on his way to his first inauguration. He left Springfield and he took a train to Washington, D.C. And one of the states he passed through was New Jersey. He passed through Trenton the day before Washington's birthday. And he addressed the state legislature. And when he was speaking to the Senate, he talked about Weems's life of Washington. And he said, boy though I was, it seemed to me there must have been something important that those men struggled for, something more than a mere struggle for independence, something of importance to all people for all time to come. And Lincoln said what that was liberty. And this is exactly what Parson Weems said the struggle was. If you read Weems's account of the Battle of Trenton, after he gets Washington and his men across the Delaware, and they still have to march several miles on to Trenton before dawn, Weems introduces an allegorical figure hovering over the American army. It's a woman. She's the spirit of liberty. And Weems says she's been driven out of Europe. She's been driven to the wilds of America. This is her last refuge. But her enemies have followed her with soldiers and armies. Who will defend her? Only this ragged band of men. Weems is presenting the Battle of Trenton as a struggle for liberty in the world. And that's what impressed young Abraham Lincoln. And that's what he recalled in 1861. And he told the New Jersey State Senate, he said, you know how those impressions in boyhood last longer than others. Weems remembered Washington not as a good boy, but as a champion of liberty. And in 1861, he saw Washington's struggle at Trenton about to be repeated in his own presidency when he should arrive in Washington, D.C. Now, the second founding father that impresses Lincoln, he encounters him in his 20s, and this is Thomas Paine. Now, Paine is best known as the journalist of the American Revolution. And Lincoln read his great journalism, Common Sense. He read The American Crisis. The first issue of The American Crisis came out before the Battle of Trenton, and it has, I'm a journalist myself, I think it's the greatest opening paragraph that's ever been in all of journalism. These are the times that try men's souls. And Paine wrote that before the Battle of Trenton was to be fought. So Lincoln read those works, but he also read The Age of Reason, which was a book Thomas Paine wrote later in his career, and it was a ferocious attack on revealed religion. Paine made some cracks at Islam and more at Judaism, but his main target was Christianity, which he hammered again and again. And in The Age of Reason, Paine recounts his unconversion experience. He said he had this when he was 7 or 8 years old, and someone in his family read a sermon at home about the substitutionary atonement, which is the Christian doctrine that Christ died for our sins. Paine said, after hearing this sermon, I revolted at the recollection of what I had heard, and thought to myself that it was making God Almighty act like a passionate man that killed his son when he could not revenge himself any other way. And as I was sure a man would be hanged that did such a thing, I could not see for what purpose they preach such sermons. Now, there's been a lot of writing about the substitutionary atonement, criticisms and many defenses and explanations. But this is a good example of Paine's technique. It's to take things at their most literal level, to try and approach them at what he would say is the most common sense level, and to attack what he felt would fail the test of reason. So Lincoln reads this in his 20s, and like many 20-year-olds, he thinks, this is great. This is just great stuff. My parents have been taking me to Baptist churches, but I'm not living with them anymore. Here's this man who explains it's all nonsense and the Bible is full of holes. I am persuaded. In fact, Lincoln was so persuaded that when he was in his early 20s, he wrote a pamphlet of his own, an attack on Christianity, which was going to argue that Jesus was just an ordinary illegitimate child, and everything should be judged by the test of reason. Now, when Lincoln wrote this, he was a postmaster. It's one of many jobs he had early in his 20s when he's trying to figure out what to do with his life. And in those days, postmasters did not have post offices. They set up in someone's store, and that's where they'd collect the mail, and you'd come in and pick it up at their desk in the store. So Lincoln is telling all his friends about this pamphlet that he's written, and the owner of the store, who's an older man named Samuel Hill, asked to see the pamphlet, and he put it in the stove, burned it up. And this was because young Lincoln was already interested in politics, and Samuel Hill knew that you did not win votes in Illinois in the 1830s by attacking Christianity. So he saved Lincoln the great embarrassment of publishing a Paineite pamphlet. Now, Lincoln learned to be discreet about his views, and I believe over the course of his life he changed them. But one thing he learned from Paine that he never let go of, that he always benefited from, is that Paine taught him how to use humor to make serious arguments. Lincoln already knew how to be funny. That was storytelling. That he picked up from Thomas Lincoln. But what Thomas Paine showed him was how you can use jokes to make serious points. Another argument of Paine's from The Age of Reason, he's talking about the virgin birth. And he says, if any young woman now were to say that she was made pregnant by a ghost and that an angel told her so, would she be believed even if she swore to it? You know, and again, this is Paine being very literal-minded, but he's also casting it as a joke. That's how he's trying to make his point. And Lincoln would use similar techniques himself in the 1850s and 60s. When his Democratic opponents would accuse him of being in favor of race mixing. And this was a charge that was hurled at the Republican Party. And the justification was, well, you don't want slavery to expand, therefore you love Negroes, therefore, you want to sleep with them. You want to marry them. And Lincoln would say, just because I do not want a black woman for a wife, just because I do not want a black woman for a slave, I do not see why I must have her for a wife. I can just let her alone. And he used this line many times. It always got a laugh. And it's a funny line, but he's also trying to make a serious point. Because if you let a black woman alone, you might also let her be free. That's another consequence. So he's making a sexual joke, but he's trying to use it to open people's minds to the notion that slavery is wrong and that it's not the permanent solution for the racial mixture of the United States. The third founding father that had an effect on Lincoln was Thomas Jefferson. And this is particularly in the 1850s and all the way through the Civil War. It begins in 1854 when the Missouri Compromise is repealed by the Nebraska Bill, which opened the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to the possibility of slavery if the people lived there wanted to vote for it. Lincoln attacked this as a repeal of the Missouri Compromise because that law in 1820 had admitted Missouri as a slave state, but said that all the rest of the Louisiana Territory on up to Canada should be free, should not admit slavery. And in 1854, the Nebraska bill is saying, well, yes, it could if the people who live there want to vote for it. And Lincoln says that this act roused him as never before, and it set the course for the rest of his life through the Civil War and through Appomattox. And the man that he turns to over and over again is Jefferson. And the Jefferson he turns to, because Jefferson had a very long and complicated career, but the Jefferson that he embraces is the young Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence when he was 33 years old. And in that declaration, among other things, he wrote that all men are created equal. And Lincoln would quote this and refer to it dozens of times. In 1854, in his Peoria speech, he called the Declaration the sheet anchor of American republicanism. Now, a sheet anchor is the strongest anchor a boat has. That's what you put down in a storm. And Lincoln saw that the storm was coming. But he said that the Declaration and the Declaration of all men's equality is our sheet anchor. In 1859, he was invited to a celebration of Jefferson's birthday in Boston. He couldn't go, but he sent them a letter which he wanted read at this function. And in it he said, all honor to Jefferson, who had the coolness and the forecast to insert into a merely revolutionary document a principle that should apply to all men at all times. And of course, the culmination of Lincoln's references to Jefferson is the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, which I quoted at the beginning, that 7 years ago, because 1863 minus 7, that's 87. 1863 minus 87 is 1776. 7 years ago, our fathers set forth on this continent the new nation, and it was dedicated, Lincoln said, to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, the Gettysburg Address was given at a ceremony to dedicate a cemetery for the Union dead after the Battle of Gettysburg, which had happened in July. Lincoln was familiar with cemeteries all his life and became much more familiar with them after the Civil War began. Lincoln lost his mother when he was 9 years old. He lost his sister Sarah when he was 20. He lost his first sweetheart, Anne Rutledge, when he was in his early 20s. He served in one war, an Indian war called the Black Hawk War. This was in northern Illinois He never saw action, but he did see a group of men who'd been scalped. He said at the top of each head there was a spot the size of a dollar, a silver dollar. And he remembered blood being everywhere. Now this was, I think, common experiences for early 19th century America. There was a lot of mortality, both from war and from diseases. One of the men in Lincoln's cabinet, Samuel Chase, he lost 3 wives. 3 different wives died, one after another. So death was a familiar thing to Americans. It was an ordinary thing. But the Civil War was extraordinary. That took it to a new level. And Lincoln, even though he was president, he was not insulated from it. Our leaders were not insulated from the consequences of battle. One of Lincoln's law students, Elmer Ellsworth, he was a young man who took the train with Lincoln from Illinois to his first inauguration in 1861. Ellsworth was killed leading an attack on Alexandria, Virginia, to free it in the earliest days of the war in the spring of 1861. In December of 1861, Edward Baker, who was an old friend of Lincoln's from Illinois politics, he was killed at the Battle of Ball's Bluff. Someone who was at Baker's funeral said that Lincoln wept like a child. Another man, William McCulloch, Lincoln had known him on his legal circuit in Illinois. As a lawyer, he would travel a circuit, and McCulloch was the court clerk in Bloomington County. And as the war began, McCulloch asked the president to help him get into an Illinois regiment. He needed the president's help because he was 50 years old and he only had one arm. He'd lost an arm in a farming accident. But Lincoln put in a word. He got to be a colonel of a regiment, and he was killed in December 1862 in northern Mississippi in the run-up to the Battle of Vicksburg. And Lincoln wrote a famous letter to his daughter, who was in great grief after her father's death, and saying that grief always hits the young the most because they have not learned to expect it. Sometimes he encountered injury. And Noah Brooks, who was an Illinois man who'd moved to California and become a reporter for the Sacramento Union. He was sent to Washington to cover the war, and he had very good access to Lincoln. And he accompanied the president and his wife on one of their many visits to military hospitals. And on this particular day, as Lincoln and Brooks were going down the rows of beds, there was a charitable woman going ahead of them who was handing out tracts to the injured soldiers. And one man took the pamphlet and glanced at it and then laughed and tossed it down on his bed. Lincoln and Brooks came up to him, and Brooks wrote that Lincoln said to the man, well, you know, this woman is trying to be helpful. It probably wasn't right to laugh at her. And the soldier said, well, Mr. President, she's given me a pamphlet on the sin of dancing, and both my legs have been shot off. So it's like a joke, but the joke was on the legless soldier and, of course, on Lincoln. And as commander-in-chief, Lincoln gets every report of every engagement, all the casualty statistics. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg looked like the turning point of the war, July 1863, and in some ways it was. By then, the war had lasted 2 years, as long as the War of 1812 or the Mexican War, which were the other American wars of the 19th century. But it didn't end. It went on and on for months and months. And the problem that this gave Lincoln, and this was Lincoln who had outgrown Thomas Paine. Paine was never an atheist. Paine said, I believe in one God and no more. He just thought organized religion was totally the wrong way to worship God. So Paine was never an atheist, nor was Lincoln. Lincoln had a very logical streak to his mind. I think one thing he retained from his parents' religion, the brand of Baptists to which they belonged believed in predestination. Lincoln stopped being a Baptist, but he never stopped believing in predestination because he thought it was logical. Every act has a cause, and every cause has a cause of its own, and so on, back and back. One of his catchphrases was, his law partner, William Herndon, heard him say it over and over: the motive was born before the man. So before you're even born, the causes of all your actions have occurred. It's just a string of causation that goes back. And where do these strings end? Well, they end, of course, with God. Because God made the world, God rules the world. And so Lincoln's problem in the Civil War is that God must want this to be happening. Lincoln wrote out a note to himself in 1862. He said, God rules the world. He could have stopped this war from happening before it began. He could stop it at any moment. Yet the war proceeds. Both sides pray to God. He can't be for both at the same time. Perhaps he's for neither. He must have some other purpose according to which this war must go on. Lincoln's secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, said that Lincoln never meant to show that paper to anyone. But he would talk about it occasionally to a few people. But the final conclusion he reveals to the nation in his second inaugural address, which is March of 1865. And it's probably the most religious speech that any president has ever given. And most of it is devoted to this question: what does God intend by this war? If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? If God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. One of the interesting things about that passage is that the Founding Fathers are gone. It's one of the only major speeches Lincoln gave in the last 11 years of his life in which they do not appear. The Gettysburg Address has said 7 years ago, to go back to 1776. But here it's 250 years of unrequited toil. Well, 1865 minus 250 is 1615. That's Jamestown. That's what Lincoln is thinking of. The first American colony, the first colony to buy and use slaves. And so that is where the sin began. The Founding Fathers are a featureless point in 250 years of this national offense, and the Civil War is our payment for it. You can see how far Lincoln has strayed from Paine. Paine said he couldn't understand the crucifixion because how could God killing his son pay for men's sins? Lincoln is telling Americans, you've died and you must continue to die until we have all paid for this national sin. But that's not the ending of the second inaugural. There's one more thought, and that's in the last paragraph. It's one sentence long. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And when I came to write about that sentence, I noticed how many of those verbs are two-syllable. Strive on, finish, bind up, care for, do all, achieve, cherish. And I thought, it's like walking. It's like walking. It's as simple as walking. It's as hard as walking when you've walked so far, and there is still so far yet to walk. That's what Lincoln told America in his second inaugural. A month later, he was murdered. We still continue to walk on with this and other problems. Thank you very much. Questions? Do we have any mics, or should people just speak up?
You speak up.
Just speak up. Okay, so, yes, ma'am.
As a footnote to Lincoln's religion, there is a pew in New York Avenue Presbyterian Church that is called the Lincoln Pew. It is from the original New York Avenue Church, and it was put there because Lincoln, it's located about a block from the White House. And Lincoln used to come down every night because he couldn't sleep and talk to Reverend Gurley in that church. Whether Gurley gave him guidance or just listened to him, I do not know. But he also wanted one of the original copies of the Emancipation Proclamation located in that church, and it is. Mm-hmm. So he had some religious feelings to walk down there and consult with the minister.
Well, and there was, there's also a very interesting testimony from Joshua Speed, who was probably the only friend Lincoln ever had. They lived together for 4 years, early in Lincoln's years in Springfield. And they bonded because they were alike. I mean, they were smart, they were depressed, they were sensitive, they were literary, they were two peas in a pod, two unhappy peas in a pod. And they drifted apart. Speed was a Kentuckian, and he moved back to Kentucky. He was from a prosperous family. They had a plantation with slaves. And in the 1850s, Speed really can't understand why Lincoln is so excited about slavery, and Lincoln can't understand why Speed can't understand. But when secession happens, Speed is a Unionist. Speed and his brother are Unionists. And Lincoln would make Speed's brother Attorney General. He offered the post to Speed, and who turned it down, and he named his brother instead. But Speed says that he visited Lincoln several times during the war, and one time he found him reading a Bible, and he said, I still can't believe that book. I mean, and obviously he's referring back to conversations they had decades earlier. I still can't believe that book. And he said, Lincoln said to him, well, Speed, you're wrong. I mean, this is really, this is the book you must read. This is the book that has the answers. Now, what did Lincoln mean by that? Did he accept Christ as his Savior? I've seen no evidence of that. He certainly is, he knows the Bible cold as literature, and he quotes it and refers to it again and again. And certainly this notion of a national sin and a national punishment is very much what Israel undergoes for its various, derelictions and fallings away. But Lincoln is, he gives this eloquent speech. Sometimes he shows what he's thinking, but he's very cagey about it. And You know, people would say, some people said, he never changed his religious views. That's what one of his secretaries said. I think it was John Hay. He said, nope, never changed his views during all the years he was president. Other people said, oh, yes, he did. So, you know, people, they looked at him, they saw what they wanted to see. It can be hard to figure out. Certainly, he wrestles with this stuff. And that's how he read. Remember, Lincoln is a boy. He doesn't understand something, he rereads it, he repeats it, he writes it down. He tries to write it in a different way. So he's still the kid that his stepmother saw, you know, writing with the charcoal on the piece of wood and then, you know, planing it off and doing it over. Only now he's trying to do it. He's president of the United States in this hecatone. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have anything you could add to illuminate whether Lincoln had a view on free will and how it dovetailed with his manifest destiny kind of beliefs?
Oh, I don't think Lincoln believed in free will. I mean, he was just a determinist. Now, you know, philosophers have tussled over this question for thousands of years. Lincoln's education was odd. He was obviously a profound man. He was not that widely read. I mean, he was an autodidact. He taught himself. I mean, any college professor would have been more widely read than Lincoln. Lots of journalists. But of course, what he did read, he read very profoundly. He loved Shakespeare. He never read all of Shakespeare's plays, for example. So Lincoln, I mean, I don't know of him reading philosophers. I think there was a text, there was a common text that was taught in psychology courses in colleges that day, which he did read, but, you know, did he read Plato or Berkeley or any of these people? No, I don't think he did. But it was just his belief and also his temperament. This is a depressed man. I think that's the one thing I learned writing this book. I knew he was melancholy. I mean, you can tell that just, you know, just look at him. There he is. He's obvious. But I wasn't aware how depressed he was. And this was lifelong. And there were a couple instances where people said we had to hide the razors. I mean, that was the extent of it. And the humor fits with that. I mean, a friend of mine, Michael Bishop, called it self-medication through humor. But and a lot of comics are depressed, you know. And Lincoln was very depressed. So, you know, and that's part of maybe depressives are more prone to not believe in free will, you know. It's just the way it is. And yet, what sort of fought against it is he's always trying to understand. Always trying to understand. And that's that little kid, you know, saying it over and over again. And then this adult, while he's trying to run a civil war, right, you know, and it's like, got to talk to Grant and what's Sherman doing, and all these generals are after me, and these politicians, and all this death and nonsense and stuff. But what does God want? You know, he's taking time to think, what does God want with all this stuff? So, there was a question. Yes, sir.
One of the economies, I think, of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence and all that is the concept of property on the one hand and liberty on the other hand. And what I'm kind of interested in is seeing how Lincoln probably didn't like slavery, but how he didn't want to get too far in front of the country in freeing all the slaves when he first started.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And part of that's politics. I mean, it's just being a good politician. He was a tremendous politician. But it's also, he believes in property. I mean, there's a very conservative, you know, sort of, small c conservative, lawyerly cast to this man. He is a lawyer. He until the Civil War, and even into the Civil War, he's trying to find ways to end slavery by compensation, you know, to pay owners. he comes up with a plan to, he thinks Delaware could be a test case because that's one of the Union states that is a slave state. It does not secede, and it's a very small state, so there are not a lot of slaves there. So he goes to Delaware and says, here's a plan. It'll cost so much money to free all your slaves by 1893. You know, and then Delaware doesn't buy it. He approaches other politicians from pro-union slave states from Kentucky, his own birthplace. He brings them into the White House. He says, look, if you will agree to this, this will really have an effect on the Civil War. There will be no chance that the Confederacy could think that you would ever join them, you know, and so on and so on. And they, you know, they just won't do it. And then so he, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation is directed to the slaves of rebels. You know, not all the slaves in the Confederacy, because some of those parts of it have been integrated into the Union, so it doesn't cover them. It's only the slaves of people still in rebellion. And he feels that that's all he can do as Commander-in-Chief. You know, he's not Congress. This is an act as Commander-in-Chief. He could only do it to the slaves of rebels in time of rebellion. And then the final measure is the 13th Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment, which he lobbies for, and Congress does approve it before he's shot. So, but you're right. There is property, you know, in our Constitution and in the thought of the Founding Fathers, and it's certainly in the thought of this man. And he's very, you know, very mindful of it and very deliberate in his approach to it. Yes, sir.
You are a scholar of Founding Fathers, and you're talking about Lincoln. Which came first, or how did you get interested in Lincoln?
Well, look, I read, you know, I read a book about George Washington when I was a kid that I think was like sort of 10th watered down Weems. I read a similar book about Lincoln. There was the story that he borrowed a book and he put it by the window at night and it got soaked in the rain, and then the man he borrowed it from made him work for 3 days to pay for the book. It could have been Weems's Life of Washington, by the way. Some people said that was that very book. But the reason I wrote this book, the sort of the provocation of it, was after my last book, which was on James Madison. I was giving a talk on it to the Federalist Society at the Yale Law School, and one of my old friends is a professor there. His name is Akil Amar, and he said, we went out for coffee afterwards, and he said, Rick, I know what your next book should be. And I said, what's that? And he said, you should write a book about Lincoln and the Founding Fathers and call it Founder's Son. And it took me like 2 seconds to say, this is brilliant. You know, I'll do it. And so in the book, I mean, he's the last one I thank in my acknowledgments, and I say I hope he likes it. But I mean, I wouldn't have said that if I hadn't given, obviously, if I hadn't given some thought to aspects of this. You know, I wrote one book about the Adams family, and I carried that story up through the Civil War. Charles Francis Adams, the son of John Quincy and the grandson of John, he was our minister to England during the Civil War. So Lincoln appears as a minor character in that book. So I had written, you know, sort of around it a little bit. And I just jumped. Yes, sir.
Yes. What's your opinion about the authenticity of the movie on Lincoln that came out about 2 years ago?
Oh, the Spielberg movie?
Yes.
Or Lincoln the Vampire Slayer? He was a vampire slayer. The vampire was slavery. No, but the Spielberg movie, if you watch it as a pageant, I thought the acting was terrific. I thought Daniel Day-Lewis did a fine job. I thought Sally Field maybe even had a harder job. Mary Lincoln is a tough character. You cannot like her, but you must not hate her. And she managed to do that. I thought Tommy Lee Jones as Thaddeus Stevens was just great. He just chewed the scenery, and that's what these old bulls in Congress are like. You know, I've seen a million of them. And even the minor characters were. Though I'll tell you the one thing that I thought. Well, two things, and it's the same, similar. It involves the same minor character. At one point, Lincoln thinks, I really need a lobbyist for this 13th Amendment. And Seward says to him, well, all right, I'll send for one from Albany. And I'm thinking, he couldn't have opened the door to his office and seen like 10 of them in the hall. He had to send to Albany. And then the guy who's the fixer, you know, who pressures the congressman and he's keeping the vote count and all this kind of stuff, he sees there's a question in Congress, are there Confederate peace commissioners coming to negotiate? Because if that's happening, why are we deciding the fate of slavery with this amendment? I mean, maybe the war will end soon. And so he realizes he's got to get some sort of denial from Lincoln. And in the movie, they have him running from Congress to the White House. And I'm thinking, he's going to be a tired boy when he gets to the White House. I mean, he should have just like, you know, in character, he should have like knocked someone off his horse and stolen it and then raced to the White House. But, you know, Spielberg didn't want to go that route.
How about one of the beginning scenes where the soldiers are quoting the Gettysburg Address to Lincoln? Did that really happen, or was that?
No, that's obviously that's made up. But no, and that's Spielberg trying to like tee up the whole movie. So he made that up. Yes, sir.
All right, we're here at Mount Vernon. How do we relate George Washington to all the things that you have said tonight about Abraham Lincoln?
Well, Lincoln, one theme I follow in my book after explaining Parson Weems and his importance is that Lincoln is not the only person claiming George Washington. Everybody is doing it. Everybody wants to do it. I mean, he's the founding father. He's the greatest man. So there are many George Washingtons stalking the earth in Lincoln's lifetime. Some of those Washingtons are, Washington is the symbol of unity. That's both the most important thing about him and the only important thing about him. And I have to say that Edward Everett, who's very important in the history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, he gave a speech on the character of George Washington in the 1850s. He was the greatest orator after the death of Clay and Webster. And as a charitable speech, he gave this speech, and he gave all the proceeds to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association when it was starting off. It was crucial in their ability to purchase and to, you know, get control of Mount Vernon. And he ran as vice president in the election of 1860 that Lincoln won. He ran on one of the other parties, the Constitutional Union Party. Their presidential candidate was John Bell. And their whole attitude was, nobody should talk about slavery. Everybody should just shut up about it, keep the country together, union over all. And of course, Everett has been saying for years, and that's what Washington is the symbol of. Lincoln would say it was a union of liberty. Before it was a union, there had to be a fight for liberty. If union was the only thing Washington thought about, he could have stayed home. I mean, he was in a bigger union, the British Empire. Why split off from that? Well, he split off from that because his liberties and the liberties of all other Americans were being infringed upon. And he fought for 8.5 years. He was a revolutionary. Then, when there was a nation founded on these principles, then there should be union. Union on that basis, but not just on any basis. I mean, that is the kind of counter-argument that Lincoln made. And Everett's last appearance in Lincoln's life is that, of course, he gives the main address at Gettysburg. Lincoln is only the minor speaker. He gave what were called dedicatory remarks. But the main oration was by Edward Everett, who gave a 2-hour speech, which is a very good speech. I mean, it's worth reading. It's very literary. It's lengthy. in a time when people were patient, and when speeches were what they did. I mean, there were hardly any concerts, obviously no movies, no organized sports. I mean, oratory and speaking were a skill that people had, and listening to it was something that they enjoyed and profited from. And Everett, he'd been the Constitutional Union guy, but once the South seceded, he stayed with the Union, and he's there at Gettysburg by Lincoln's side. Yes, sir.
When I finished reading your current book, Rick, and I put it next to the other one, what's going to come next?
I'm taking suggestions. Akil Lamar gave me a suggestion. I'm taking some others. So I have friends who can just line them up like airplanes, waiting to take off. I can't do that. I got to get the old one out into the world, and then I can think. Yes, sir.
So Abraham Lincoln was able to push the envelope in a lot of ways in what a president could do. And he did that because of the circumstances he was in. Is there some way you can talk that, in your mind, he ties that ability to suspend habeas corpus and some of the things that he did sort of outside the envelope of probably what a president was allowed to do constitutionally? Was there any way he tied that back to his knowledge or perceptions of the founding fathers?
Well, the Constitution says that habeas corpus may be suspended in time of invasion or rebellion. And that was, that's Lincoln's situation in which he does it. And then his first act is to suspend it on the railroad from Washington to Philadelphia, and then he suspends it over the entire country so that recruiting can proceed. Now, it was challenged, and Chief Justice Taney, whose great gift to America had been the Dred Scott decision, ruled that the president does not have this power. That power rests in Congress. Then Congress passed an act which suspended habeas corpus nationwide. The Confederacy also suspended it. They suspended it before the Union, actually. But, for the same reason. I'm not trying to say, ooh, those bad Confederates. I mean, I do say that. But not for this reason. I mean, they were doing it for the same reasons and in the same means and for the same situation, that Lincoln was. He was responding to a rebellion. They were saying, well, we're being invaded. Therefore, for the duration, we must suspend it. And when Lincoln, Lincoln was attacked for this, and his letter, he wrote a letter where he said that this is only a war measure, and he said, if a man takes emetics during a disease, is he going to feed on them for the rest of his healthful life? So he was saying, when the war ends, this will stop, obviously. And that's what he believed. Now, of course, he was killed, but I can't imagine him ever saying, oh, well, okay, this was so great, let's keep it up. I simply don't believe he would have done that. One more, yes, ma'am.
I have an ongoing debate with myself for many years now as to who the better president was, Washington or Lincoln. So we just appreciate
Think very carefully.
No. Well, I have, but you can't ask the question because Lincoln was murdered. His work was half done. The equivalent would be if Washington had died somehow after returning his commission to Congress in Annapolis in 1783. And then he would have been the hero of the Revolution, the man who not only freed the country and beat the British, but never seized power himself and was going home to retire. Wasn't he a great guy? And he would have been, eternally so. But he had a second half of his life. John Wilkes Booth accomplished a lot. Never underestimate John Wilkes Booth. On that jolly note, I will.